Welcome, YouTube. Today, I'm incredibly excited to have one of the world's preeminent philosophers of biology, Elliott Sober. Now, there is a bit of a backstory to this show. That is, I debated a critic of evolution, Subboor Ahmad, and Suboor quoted Elliott to support his case. So I thought it'd be fun to have Elliott review Suboor's and my arguments. So welcome, Elliott. How are you doing? I know you just had COVID. Have you recovered?
I'm almost recovered. I finished Paxlovid tomorrow, and I think I got off easy. It took me a week to get to where I am. So yeah, it was the first time I've had COVID.
How did you make it all the way to 2024?
I don't know. My wife and I thought we were the absolute last people on earth who haven't had COVID, but now it caught up with us. And we didn't do anything special. We weren't, sequestering ourselves any more than other people were doing. We're just lucky for a while.
Wow. Okay. So, I'm glad you're on the mend and everything's good. So before we get into the details and sort of play clips that you'll review, Suboor and I focus on the topic of human-chimp common ancestry. And so, Elliott, as a philosopher of biology, maybe you can just give us a very brief assessment of where academics stand on this issue. What's the sort of evidential status of human-chimp common ancestry?
Well, let me put it in a broader context. The idea of universal common ancestry is completely standard in evolutionary biology now. By that, I mean the idea that everything that's alive today on Earth traces back to a single common ancestor. That could be a population of cells, but we're all related. It's not just us and chimps. We are related to yeast, to plants and animals, to bacteria.
I seem to remember in your book, you said something like no competent biologist would doubt it or something. Do I remember that right? Was it something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I may have said that. I think that's right. I mean, it is conceivable that some novel organism will be discovered whose genetic code is not just a little different from the nearly universal code, but radically different. And, this might be a shock and a huge discovery, and evolutionary biologists will cope with that as a need to revise their idea. But as things now stand, it's just the received wisdom.
Right. Okay. And so let's start playing some of these clips. Now, they have been somewhat edited for time purposes, but I'll put a link below so people can see the non-edited versions. The first clip is where Suboor gives an analogy from human-chimp common ancestry to a crime show.
We have DNA of the intruder who broke into the house and committed the murder. Right. Program over. We know for certain that this person committed the murder because we have that key piece of information. This is the level of certainty that Darwinists want us to have when it comes to human-chimp ancestry. It's like it's a done deal, guys. You have to be a complete moron to not believe in this. I mean, come on, look at this fossil. Look at this particular similarity between human beings and chimpanzees on a DNA level. Look at this, look at this, look at this. But what I want to do today is simply show the difference between the popular understanding of Darwinian evolution, which is propagated by these Darwinists, and the way that's academically understood.
So, Elliott, do you think there's like a big disparity between the confidence we would have in a murder case where we have the DNA evidence versus the confidence we would have for human-chimp common ancestry?
I think of them as very similar to each other. But there's a framework issue that Suboor has raised, which is a big mistake that he's making. The idea that forensic DNA provides certainty about who committed the murder is false. The murderer might have had a twin brother who did it. Maybe someone planted this guy's DNA on the crime scene to conceal his own role in killing the guy. So the observation of DNA and seeing that it matches some individual, I mean, it's strong evidence, but it's not absolute certainty. And as we'll see in other excerpts from Suboor's presentation, he thinks that that's what's required in science. And if science had to produce absolute certainty about things, there wouldn't be much science left. What's feasible and done in science is finding strong evidence for one hypothesis as opposed to another. And I want to emphasize two parts of that. First, the search is for strong evidence. And secondly, and very importantly, the idea is you're not testing all possible theories. You're testing theories that make testable predictions about the observations you're making. So our certainty is limited by the fact that we can't think of all possible alternative theories. No human being can do that.
Right. Actually, one thing I was thinking of was when they do the DNA test, they have this thing called the random match probability, and I believe it's something like if it gets to 1 in a billion, then we say it's a match, and that's also probabilistic, right? I mean,
absolutely. Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. So let's go to the next clip where Suboor's going to lay out what he thinks are the sort of dubious assumptions of evolution.
The first assumption is the assumption of naturalism. Now, naturalism is a governing principle in science, which is every single thing that scientists look at, they have to explain naturalistically. A natural effect has a natural cause. Therefore, by definition, human beings have to be linked to non-human ancestors. The second assumption is the assumption of homology. Now, homology is the idea that similarities are due to common descent. Now, homology has been used a lot of the times by Darwinists in a circular way, in the following way. Similarities are due to common descent. Similarities exist. Therefore, common descent is true. That's circular reasoning. The only thing they can say about homology is we assume this, and that's it. There's another assumption, which is the tree of life, which is universal common ancestry. So a human being, a chimpanzee, a blade of grass, an elephant, a mushroom, a dolphin, whatever, every single thing has a common ancestor going back, billions of years, which goes back to the first cell. So a sub-branch of, a sub-understanding of that particular tree of life is that human chimp ancestry is true. So this single origin is another assumption. And of course, that assumption is challenged by other evolutionary biologists. The fourth assumption is the most devastating, which is A to Z is done by natural selection. Now, you can show all the similarities till the cows come home, but that means nothing because Darwin's theory of evolution is not a theory of similarity. It's a theory of transmutation, a theory of transformation, a theory which shows how you can get from a bacteria-like organism to an elephant, how you can get from a chimpanzee-like common ancestor to a human being. So that's the fourth assumption, that this change from A to Z, A to B, has been done by natural selection.
Are these like these four assumptions like the Achilles heel of evolution? Do they justify? I think Subboor channel used to be called something like Darwinian delusion. Do these assumptions justify that?
Some biologists will agree with Suboor that naturalism is an assumption in science, not something that can be tested. I think on reflection, that's not exactly right because we know, based on evidence, that some supernatural hypotheses about non-natural entities are false. For example, we know that young Earth creationism is a false theory because it tells us that life began no more than 50,000 years ago because God created the earth, created life then. That's a hypothesis about God, and the data tells us it's wrong. So scientists should be a little bit more careful sometimes and say there are some hypotheses about God, some non-naturalistic hypotheses, which we can test. And again, the emphasis is on testability.
So can I just ask, what about the claim that humans were created de novo rather than with a common ancestor with chimp? Is that a testable hypothesis?
It certainly is. Human beings would not have the fantastically large genetic similarity with other primates, with other mammals, with other vertebrates, and so on. You wouldn't expect that to be true if they arose entirely independently of the rest of the living world. It's the observation of similarity, for example, the near universality of the genetic code that biologists regard as just killer evidence that human beings are part of nature.
Right. And what about these other assumptions? So the next one was homology, that we assume homology and therefore we conclude homology, and it's sort of circular reasoning.
Well, let me say what I think biologists usually mean by homology. So when you say the two organisms have a given characteristic, say two human beings have opposable thumbs, and that's a homology, what that means is that the two individuals inherited that trait unmodified from a common ancestor who had opposable thumbs. So the idea of homology already has built into it the idea that common ancestry is true. So again, biologists are sometimes not careful about this. I think homology is not, it's misleading to say it's evidence for common ancestry because it presupposes common ancestry. What is evidence for common ancestry are certain kinds of similarities. And that word does not have an evolutionary history built into it.
Right. And we'll come on to which similarities are evidence and which are not. So the other two were the universal common ancestor, and we have to assume natural selection. So do you want to just quickly comment on those?
Well, when you're asking, the question we're starting with is, so why do we think that human beings and chimpanzees have a common ancestor? A biologist can and should approach that question without needing to think about the much bigger question of universal common ancestry. I mean, universal common ancestry, as I said, is something that's regarded as very well supported, but it's not presupposed when you pick up two species and tell me why these two guys are closely are have a common ancestor. You don't have to assume universal common ancestor to address that.
Right. Okay, so let's go on to the bits of the debate that I had with Suboor. And the first bit was a piece of evidence that I offered, which was regard to something called pseudogenes, which, as I understand it, are genes that have lost their original function. And there's a particular pseudogene called nanog, where humans have, I think, 11 copies of the nanog pseudogene, and chimps have the same, apart from one. So they have 10 copies of the nanog pseudogene. And the one that we don't share is called nanog P8. And what I said was there were a number of tests that we could do for common ancestry. So one, if it's the only one that's not in the chimp genome, it should have become a pseudogene after the lineage is split. So therefore, and all the other ones should be before the lineage is split. So therefore, nanog P8 must be the youngest pseudogene. And the date should be, no later than, if it's 6 million years, it can't be older than 6 million years. It's been dated to, I don't know, something like 1.5 million years, give or take 500,000 years. So it should be the youngest. It should be no older than 6 million years. And it turns out that we think the Neanderthals split after that. So it should be in the Neanderthal genome. So, and indeed it is. So all three of these came back as evidence. And so I presented that, and this is how Suboor replied. If it turned out that nanog P8 was not the youngest of the pseudogenes, if it was 100 million years old, that would be very strong evidence against human common ancestry, would it not?
No, it wouldn't. Why not? I'll tell you why. Because homology, the idea that humans they did not come in the history of the world by themselves, de novo. They are linked to something else, primates or whatever. This is a basic assumption in science, and there is no piece of evidence that can go against it.
How is that? How would that be? How would that not be evidence against it? You haven't explained anything. You've just stated.
No. Let me explain why.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is linked to my previous point, which I was about to make about genetics. So science begins off with methodological naturalism, which is the idea that anything that we look at, we are going to assume there is a natural explanation. So when you look at me and you, a Blade of Grass or Lady Gaga, they're going to assume we're going to have a naturalistic explanation. Correct? Do you agree with me so far?
I think the answer to that's complicated, so you carry on.
Okay, but I'm going to make a blanket statement. You can challenge it afterwards, which is that is the very crux of the scientific method, methodological naturalism. So, methodological naturalism means that anything a scientist or evolutionary biologist studies, they're going to assume that they have a natural explanation. Because of that,
human beings and chimpanzees, or human beings or something, if chimpanzees or primates didn't exist, right? If something else existed, which was, I don't know, whatever, pigs, whatever, right? We would always be linked to something which is non-human, simply because of that assumption of methodological naturalism. So there is no piece of evidence which can go against that foundational assumption of science.
So, Elliott, thoughts?
He's not addressing what you said. He's going back to what we've already reviewed, the commitment to naturalism, to the tree of life, and so on. I thought the example you gave was compelling.
Right. So would you agree that if it was the case that Nanak P8 was not the youngest, it was 100 million years old, that would be evidence against common ancestry?
Yes, absolutely. That's what testability means, that there's some observations that favor it, but if they came out the opposite, that would disfavor the hypothesis. Quite so.
Right.
Yeah.
What we do is we look at all the evidence and look at, how we weight it and make an assessment, right?
Right. Okay. Suboor says that one of the assumptions about inferring common ancestry that's always made in biology is that evolution in every way is driven by natural selection. Now, it's true that in Darwin's theory and in contemporary evolutionary theory too, natural selection is regarded as an important cause. It's not the only cause. And in fact, in terms of evidence for common ancestry, Darwin and modern biology also recognize that advantageous characteristics that are similar often offer very meager evidence for common ancestry. So the fact that whales and sharks are shaped like torpedoes, Darwin says that's not strong evidence that they have a common ancestor, because you would expect large aquatic predators to evolve that very useful shape, even if they had separate ancestry. His point is that where the killer evidence comes from is in similarities that are useless or deleterious, and these do not evolve because there's selection for them. So the idea that evolutionary theory is limited to natural selection as a possible cause of evolution is incorrect. And it's important to notice that when you're thinking about what counts as strong and weak evidence for common ancestry.
Right. And also, there's one other thing I was thinking of was, isn't it the case that there were people who believed there was spontaneous creation of each sort of species? And you could have a naturalistic version of that, could you not? So therefore, it wouldn't be the case that just because you're a naturalist, you're committed to evolution or natural.
Yes, absolutely right. In fact, Lamarck, who was famous 50 years before The Origin of Species appeared, he had a naturalistic theory of evolution in which there were multiple independent startups from non-living materials, not caused by God or anything. And what we see now in the diversity of life, what we're seeing is mostly not going to trace back to a single common ancestor. So we and modern day worms, according to Lamarck, do not have a common ancestor. However, human beings have worm-like ancestors. Because for human beings to appear in a lineage, you have to go through all these simpler and then more complicated steps before you reach human beings. Whereas modern worms have their own ancestry back to a startup. So Lamarck was a naturalist, and he also had the idea. He denied the idea of universal common ancestry.
Right. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the next clip, where I was going to quote the anthropologist Jonathan Marks.
Genetics, all it tells you is that you have this particular field, just like all the rest of the fields, in which you have an assumption of homology. That's all you actually have. Now, let me give you some evidence for this. Jonathan Marks, he's the atheist evolutionary biologist. You can check this out yourself. He believes human chimp ancestry is true. He's an atheist. So for him, foundationally, human beings have to be linked to something else in life. Yet he, in his book, which is published by Oxford University, called Evolutionary Anthropology: A New Introduction, right, an alternative introduction, he says about homology. He says, what has genetics actually taught us from the time of Linnaeus, which is prior Darwin? in terms of genetics? He says absolutely nothing. It can give us new information, but it doesn't change the foundational assumption of homology.
All right. So thoughts on this? Are you familiar with this work, or what are your thoughts?
No, I'm not. And it's the old point we've discussed, that genetics relies on the idea of homology. I mean, what propositions in genetics are we talking about here? Medical genetics doesn't require the assumption of universal common ancestry. It's not. I mean, when you talk about the genetic causes of diseases, you can do that without getting into universal common ancestry. So I don't know what propositions he's talking about here, saying genetics depends on universal common ancestry and naturalism, and all these very general things like that.
So I think my understanding of reading Jonathan Marks, and I actually emailed him, so we'll come to that in a second, what he said, was that what he was saying was there's a question of how similar should we consider ourselves to chimpanzees? Does the fact that we can do calculus mean there's a huge gap between us and chimpanzees, or is it trivial? So that's an interesting philosophical question, and genetics doesn't answer that question. And I think that's what he was saying. And in order to sort of test this, I actually emailed Jonathan Marks, and we had a few emails going back and forth because he was quite upset that Suboor was quoting him. So I asked him, I gave him two statements to see if he agreed with them. And I think if Suboor was right, he should strongly disagree with these statements. But here's the two statements. So one is there is compelling evidence that humans and chimps share a recent common ancestor. And he said strongly agree. And then the next one was that genetics has revealed new evidence that humans and chimps share common ancestry that we did not have before the advent of genetics. And he said, agree, but more weakly, depending on A, what you think of gorillas, and B, what you count as new genetic knowledge. So after all, we knew that chimp blood is more similar to human blood than horse blood is to donkey blood back in the 1920s. And he also made a few other emails to me, and I won't read them all because it's too much, but I'll just read a little bit here. So, quote, wow, Suboor seems to have discovered metaphysics. Clearly, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and a very little knowledge is especially dangerous. Of course, there are assumptions that go into scientific reasoning, and those assumptions have led us to our present understanding of the history of life. He sounds disappointed that science has excluded whatever he seems to believe about humans and apes, although he is curiously reluctant to state what that is. It sounds like he is about to reject the entire fossil record as fraudulent and maybe go into full flat earth selective denialism. I'd say similarity is an observation, although culture-laden. Homology is an inference. That was what Jonathan Mark said. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That sounds exactly right.
Right. Okay. So we're about to get to when he quotes you, but we've got one more bit before that. And here he's going to talk about ants and their similarity to humans.
Why is it that the closest to us in human behavior is not actually the chimpanzee, is actually the ant? Ants have warfare, ants have economics, ants have actually...
chimps also have warfare.
Hang on one second. Let me finish this point. Sociologically, according to evolutionary biologists, the closest thing to human beings is actually the ant. And there's a book on this, E.O. Wilson's The Social Conquest of the Earth, right? And there's other atheist evolutionary biologists who've admitted the closest to the human being in terms of our social capabilities is the ant. The closest to human beings in terms of our intellectual capabilities is actually the crow, right? Now, those observations which go against the sort of a priori sort of, before looking at the evidence, if someone was to assume if homology is true, then this would be true. Those haven't changed at all the epistemic weighing of human chimp ancestry, those dissimilarities. Why haven't they? Because the assumption that you begin with is always going to remain an assumption, and the similarities that you see, you're going to say are due to common ancestry. The dissimilarities you're going to say are due to homoplasy. There is no piece of evidence that can undermine that.
So, Elliott, there are, ants have got very interesting societal structures. Crows are very smart. Does that undermine human-chimp common ancestry, as Suboor claims?
Absolutely not. I mean, he says that humans and ants are closest to each other with respect to behavior. And with respect to intellectual abilities, humans and crows are closely related. Well, let's suppose for the moment that that's true. What does that have to do with common ancestry? Why does that show that humans and ants are more closely related to each other than either is to chimpanzees? It shows nothing of the kind. I mean, he's picking up on some similarities that we share with organisms that are not super closely related to us. That's not news to evolutionary biology. Of course that happens. That's what convergence is all about. I mean, and by the way, his mentioning E.O. Wilson on behalf of his idea is a huge distortion. Wilson, of course, believed that human beings are very closely related to chimpanzees and only distantly related to ants. But he thought there were interesting social differences, social similarities like division of labor and warfare and slave making, stuff like that.
And what about
this
this
consistent
argument
with common ancestry?
Right. And then what about this argument that, if we see a similarity, we say common, that's evidence for evolution. We see a dissimilarity, we say, hey, convergent evolution. No. So it's like heads we win, tails you lose. Is that fair? Or?
Well, what doesn't happen when you bring in convergence in standard evolutionary biology, you're not denying common ancestry. You're just saying, yes, there's a common ancestor, but these characteristics we're talking about arose independently. Yes, there was a common ancestor, but it did not have the trait that you're seeing in both of these descendants. So ants have, let's suppose there's some social similarity between some ant species and human beings. It's not a homology because the most recent common ancestor that biologists believe exists connecting human beings and ants did not have that social structure. So starting from that common ancestor, this novel social form has to evolve independently in the two lineages. And that's why it's called a homoplasy.
Right. Okay. And is it actually true that ants are the most similar in behavior and crows are the most similar in intelligence? I mean, wasn't aware there was an objective test of intelligence that you could just match them up.
No, I wouldn't put any weight on that. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are some social similarities. Look, there are plenty of social similarities between us and chimpanzees and bonobos. Right. Let's not leave them out. So, right. I mean, you can't pick and choose here.
Right. And then the last point, I guess, would be that these are functional things, and we don't claim that we can infer common ancestry from the similarity in functional things. As we'll come, we're going to come on to that in the next clip, I guess. So let's play this next clip. Here's where he actually quotes you in the argument. So this is where I think things are really going to be particularly interesting.
Okay, now what you've done is you've actually committed a fallacy now. You've committed the fallacy of equivocation. We are speaking about homology, and he's speaking about natural selection. Now, homology is a necessary condition for human-chimp ancestry to be true, but it's not a sufficient condition. For it to be sufficient, you need a mechanism. And a mechanism, in terms of science, can never be proven because of the inductive nature of science. Now, what you've done there is you've said, he is assuming these things, but those are the assumptions of natural selection. Now, Henry Gee and any other evolutionary biologist in the world, they do actually believe in the assumption of homology, and they also, prior to that, have the assumption of methodological naturalism. Now, Elliott Sober, who is an atheist, again, evolutionary biologist, if you don't dispute who's an atheist, we can deal with that too. He is an atheist evolutionary biologist. In his book, Evidence and Evolution, which is published by by Cambridge University, he says, the idea that humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have independent ancestry because they're so different, they're both naive. Because within a probabilistic framework, there is no must. And he goes on in that same very book, speaking about homology, homoplasy, and the ad hoc rationalizations which do actually exist in the field.
So, Elliott, is he quoting you fairly, or is this a bit of a misquote?
I did say, and I do believe that the must is a huge exaggeration, and this gets back to something we discussed before about there being no absolute certainty in science. So we have compelling evidence for common ancestry. Does the evidence we have show that it's impossible for there not to be common ancestry? No, it doesn't show it's impossible. It just shows that it's extremely improbable.
Right. And then the bit after that, if I remember rightly in that book, where you said, okay, similarities, you can't infer, it's naive to infer similarities from functional things, but it's legitimate to infer common ancestry from similarities in non-functional things. Do you want to elaborate on that?
That's back to this point that I was quoting from Darwin about the torpedo shape of sharks and whales. He thought that that's weak evidence. It's not no evidence, but it's much weaker evidence than things that are useless, similarities that are useless, like the tailbones that we share with chimpanzees, for example. Human beings do not benefit from having that tailbone, as many of us have discovered in our lives. So that's the stronger evidence, and neutral similarity also. And genetics has a lot to say about the existence of genes that aren't functional, and these are often providing strong evidence about genealogical relationships.
Right. So to bring it back to the nano example I gave, if I said we both have a same functional nano gene, that would be weak evidence, maybe. But where we get to the pseudo genes, which they've lost their function, that's stronger evidence. And I think maybe Suboor is trying to sort of look at them all in the same way. Oh, we're looking at similarities, and so we infer common descent, and that's naive. But what's naive is just the functional bit, not the other bits.
I mean, I would want to put a caveat about the wholesale dismissal of adaptive similarities. The genetic code that an organism uses is extremely adaptive, because if it had a different code from the code used by conspecifics, it couldn't reproduce. So it really matters a lot. And yet biologists, so it's a very adaptive trait that you have and I have, to have the genetic code we have rather than a different one, given that everybody else in our species has this first code. So we have to make room for an example like that. So Darwin was exaggerating. I mean, he didn't think about an example like this, I don't think. So there are some adaptive similarities that I think do provide strong evidence for common ancestry.
Right. And what about this argument you often hear from intelligent design people, where they say the same gene, same designer? That's really all you're seeing.
Same gene, same designer?
Well,
I'm
same
sorry.
design, basically we're saying, well, it's just evidence that the designer is the same, so he's going to use the same genetic code.
Yes.
Because
well, that's an example of how creationists in the old days and in the present can accommodate any observation that happens to come up in science by saying, oh, God did that. Well, you can say that, but what you're doing is simply accommodating the observations. You haven't produced any theory that would lead that to suggest that that's true. It's so flexible and in a way empty that there's no observation that will ever disprove the idea that God created the world or created living things on Earth, full stop, without saying anything about what kinds of organisms he had in mind, why he chose these organisms rather than that. It's very minimalistic. The theory makes no novel predictions. If it made predictions that are surprising, that turned out to be true, that would be interesting. That's not happening.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to the next clip, where he's going to talk again about no mechanism, but there's some other interesting things that are said. So let's have a look.
If you can show all the similarities between humans and chimps, humans and pigs, humans and whatever, if there is no mechanism of transformation, all you have is a story. Which is why, and this is the last point I'm going to make, you can try and refute all these points, human-chimp ancestry was something which the ancient Greeks believed in, the ancient Hindus believed in, the Enlightenment Victorian thinkers also believed in, including Darwin and his grandfather. The reason why this idea took off is because Darwin gave a mechanism, the mechanism of natural selection. If the mechanism breaks, or if the mechanism is shown to be insufficient,
you cannot claim human chimp ancestry is true.
So any thoughts on that? I mean, one thing I found was interesting, you said human chimp common ancestry goes all the way back, thousands of years. Now, I am aware there were some ideas about some form of evolution. I wasn't aware that they said human chimps had a common ancestor, though. Any thoughts on this?
Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, endorsed the idea of something close to universal common ancestry.
Right, but going all the way back thousands of years.
No, I'm not aware of that.
Right. And then what about this claim that if the mechanism breaks, then you can't infer ancestry?
The mechanism being natural selection.
So if we found that natural selection was false, then out goes all common ancestry.
This is wrong for the reason I mentioned, that traits that are evolved for reasons other than natural selection often provide very strong evidence for common ancestry. There's a whole body of theory in population genetics called the neutral theory of molecular evolution, where the idea is that different genes do not differ in how well organisms do who have the genes. So they're neutral with respect to each other, but yet they, by chance, evolve and frequencies change. And biologists often look for genes like this as data that helps you reconstruct common ancestry relationships. So there's not a reliance on natural selection.
Right. Okay. All right. So the next bit was a piece of evidence that I offered about the cytochrome C protein. So for those that don't know, this is a ubiquitous protein. It's found in like all living things, and it's essential for life. And what I claimed was that there are different parts of the amino acid sequence that you could have different sequences that will give you the same functional protein. So given that, there's no reason for humans and chimps to be, so similar, because you could change that amino acid sequence and get the same functional protein. So this is known as functional redundancy. And so I claim then that humans and chimps being, in fact, what's very interesting is that you can take the human cytochrome C gene out, you can place it into yeast, and genetic engineers have actually done this and shown that with the yeast, cytochrome C still functions perfectly well. So there's no reason for them to be so similar, because different amino acid sequences give you the same function. And so I thought that was very strong evidence for human chimp common ancestry. So let's see what he says.
What's the null hypothesis here? The null hypothesis would be the amino acid sequences would be randomly distributed. So Here's the point. And this just goes to show how ignorant people like him are. Null hypothesis is that you will have randomness. Why the hell would you have that as a null hypothesis? Because anything is better than that. To the initial point, which was about the null hypothesis being random. Yeah. Okay? I want you to tell me, firstly, this. Why is it random? First point. Secondly, when it comes to two things being anatomically similar, which idiot would come up with an idea that their genetics would not also be similar rather than being random?
Thoughts on this? I mean, does the fact that humans and chimps are so anatomically similar mean that really they should have similar cytochrome C amino acid sequence?
I'm still a little confused by what Suboor is saying here. He talks about the null hypothesis. What I understand that to mean is the hypothesis that says there is no difference between two things. That is, the difference is zero. That's what null means. But I don't understand how that idea is relevant to talking about the biological example. I don't get it.
Well, I should quote, I mean, he did say which idiot came up with this. And so I did get it from Douglas Theobald, who's the chair of the biochemistry department at Brandeis University. And I give you a quote from him. He said, and this is an essay he wrote on Talk Origins website. In terms of a scientific statistical analysis, the null hypothesis is that the identity of non-essential amino acids in the cytochrome C proteins from humans and chimps should be random with respect to one another. However, from the theory of common descent and our standard phylogenetic tree, we know that humans and chimps are quite closely related. We therefore predict, in spite of the odds, that humans and chimps cytochrome C sequence should be much more similar than, say, human and yeast cytochrome C.
Good. I get that. That's absolutely right. That is, if you have neutral evolution, more closely related species will be more similar to each other than more distantly related species, because they've had the more distantly related pair have had more time to diverge, and selection isn't freezing them where they are. It's a random walk. Whereas with a more recent common ancestor, you have less time, and therefore you expect more similarity. That's the sound bit of reasoning.
Right. Okay, good. All right. So the next bit, we've sometimes hear from creationists that evolution is racist. So this came up when I presented an argument based on what are called Vavilov centers. So, but I present the argument in the clip here so people can see what the argument is.
What we should find is that the genetic diversity in human populations should be highest at the center of origin. This is called Vavilov's theory. This is widely accepted in genetics. The origin center is where you have the highest genetic diversity. So if we found, we could look at different ethnicities, Europeans, Eskimos, Native Americans, Aboriginals, whoever. And if evolution is true, sub-Saharan Africans should have the highest genetic diversity. If it turned out that Eskimos had the highest genetic diversity, that would be evidence against human-chimp common ancestry. That would be evidence against human...
Wait.
Right?
Hang on. That's a non sequitur.
No, it isn't.
That's a total non sequitur. You're assuming, and this is a very racist thing, by the way, that East Africa is where you have the great apes, and that's where the black people are.
No, that's where you have the fossils.
Wait, hang on.
It's not racist
It is racist, and I'll tell you why.
How is it racist?
I'll tell you why. Because we do actually have fossils which are also in other parts of Asia, such as China, which could also be interpreted as the beginning of human beings.
Okay, Elliott, was this a racist argument? Did I?
Of course not. Of course not. And as before, he changes the subject by talking about Asia. I mean, your argument's correct, and it's actually very connected to the thing we just discussed a minute ago. People now who are, let us say, living in, let us say, Europe, who have European ancestry, they have a more recent common ancestors, on average, than take all the people who live in Africa now who have African ancestry. And the reason for that is that the African populations, you have to go back further to get to their common ancestors. So there's been more time to diverge, whereas humans living in Europe is a much more recent thing, and there's been less time for that founder population or populations to diverge from each other. So the recent common ancestry means less diversity among descendants. Ancient common ancestry means greater diversity among descendants. That's sound reasoning.
Right. And this is what we were talking about, that we have predictions from the theory. So we could have come back. They did genetic studies on people in sub-Saharan Africa, and they found they had the highest genetic diversity out of other groups. And it could have come back the other way, and that would have been evidence against evolution, would it have not been?
Well, it would have been evidence about perhaps the thought about human migration patterns. I mean, evidence against the whole of evolutionary theory.
No, I mean,
no way.
Our understanding of human-chimp common ancestry, and
the idea that our species are originated in Africa, and then a series of migrations took us to the Middle East, to Europe, to Asia, to the South Pacific, and so on.
What about this argument
and the Americas being?
What about this argument that we've got hominid fossils in Asia and we just ignore those? Is that a legitimate argument?
We don't ignore them, but that's the considered view is sure there's a story to be told about human evolution in Asia, but if you're drawing the tree of life for the human race, African origins is the standard, well supported picture.
Right. Okay. All right. So the penultimate clip is also he's quoting you again here, and this was actually not from the debate. I actually met him a little bit afterwards, and he made a new argument here. So let's have a listen to it.
Origination probabilities, if you imagine a bead from 0 to 1, origination probabilities are close to 0. So we assume that life is very rare and it came about once. That's the assumption. And when it comes to transition probabilities, the bead goes from 0 to 1, close to 1. That there's a mechanism by which life transforms. Now, if we change these assumptions, we change the probability of the tree of life. And that's super important, because what you just said to my friend right now is actually false. What you actually said was that there's overwhelming evidence for common ancestry, but you never pointed out these hidden assumptions.
Okay.
Okay. So can you explain these different probabilities? What's happening like this?
So our origination probabilities. Let's talk about the big picture now. The beginning of life on Earth. The theory of evolution does not say that there was exactly one startup of living things from non-living materials. There could have been thousands or millions. The claim of universal ancestry says not that there was one startup, but all the life we see today traces back to a single startup. That's
so. Is
different.
it right that then the others just didn't leave descendants that we still
that's
have?
right. They're gone, but they existed, right? So the idea of the origin probability is 0. Well, no. Why think that? Maybe. Who knows what it was, but to the point that's not relevant to the idea of universal common ancestry. The transition probability is equal to 1. The transition from what to what is equal to 1. The idea that everything that happens from the origin of life to the present had to happen because the probability was 1 at each step. No biologist believes that. So natural selection is a probabilistic process, just like random genetic drift is. I mean, the details are different. So the idea that transition probability is equal to 1 I don't know what he's even talking about there.
Right. Okay. He did mention something called Sober's paradox, which I thought I knew what it was, but then when I went back home, I actually realized I didn't know what it was. Are you familiar with this?
No, I wonder what my paradox is.
Okay. Well, actually, I did read it. I did when I tried to look for it. I think it was on a creationist website, so that maybe that's where he got it from.
Paradox. Yeah, I don't know.
All right. Okay. So we'll go to the last clip now. I mean, obviously, we're not going to read the entire debate because it's too long. So we want to try and get things to roughly an hour. So the last argument that I presented was that humans have much larger brains than other apes. And so if humans descended from a common ancestor with these other apes, if we plot the fossil record out over time, we should see that the hominid skulls are getting bigger with larger volume for bigger brains. And so the fact that we plot this out and we do see this upward slope was evidence in the fossil record for evolution. So let's see how Suboor applies to that.
Now, a particular point that you actually made is that we should be seeing it getting bigger over time, right? Now, that is not the way that Darwinian evolution works. Darwinian evolution doesn't work by progression.
What do you mean it doesn't work by progression?
This idea, the old idea of the great chain of being...
Yeah, but no one's claiming that's right. The argument doesn't depend on that at all.
But what you're saying is we should... No, what you're saying is that we should be seeing it getting bigger over time.
Yes.
Why?
Because we have big brains and chimps don't. That's why.
I'm not saying big brain is better. But then what you've...
I'm just saying it's that
and
we have it, they don't.
And this is the problem, Phil. This is the problem. This is why I want you to understand this point. Chimp, human.
Yep.
Assuming common ancestry.
Yep.
Similarities exist. Therefore, common ancestry is true. This is circular reasoning.
All right. last clip then. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's just another example of changing the subject. I mean, you were talking about a very particular example, saying that since human beings have a larger brain than chimpanzees, you were assuming that the ancestors were more like chimpanzees the most recent common ancestor's brain was more like a chimp's brain than ours. And of course, if that's right, then in the lineage leading from that common ancestor up to human beings, there will be a net increase in brain size. That's right. I mean, so that's fine. There is a kind of interesting inferential problem here, is that when you observe the characteristics of two descendants, and you do not observe the characteristic of their most recent common ancestor, what's the most reasonable hypothesis about what was going on down there? Should you think, oh, the ancestor must have been halfway in between, must have been closer to this one rather than that? And that's an interesting kind of logical question. But his reply to you wasn't about that. It was about, naturalism and all that.
Right. Okay. All right. So look, before we sort of finish off, do you want to sort of sum up, this basic approach that I think what Suboor wants to say is that people that give popular accounts of human chimp common ancestry are hiding the fact that academics, philosophers like yourself, think that actually, we're far less confident than we should be about evolution in general, about human chimp common ancestry, things like this. Do you want to sort of sum up the basic sort of approach that Suboor takes, what you think of it?
Well, he demands for science to be justified in asserting something. It has to be a matter of absolute certainty. And given that very high bar, he's saying that science doesn't really do it, and people are misrepresenting science when they say that this is what we know from the point of view of science. But certainty is not what science is about. It's good support from evidence that's the heart of it.
Right. I mean, generally, we would have to rule out almost all of science if we ask for certainty, right?
Yeah, of course.
Right.
Certainly, science. Yes, all of science. And in the present context, inferences about the past based on observations of the present. All the historical sciences won't count as science either, which is, of course, silly.
Yeah. And philosophy as well, right? I mean, things in philosophy aren't certain either, right?
Right. Although philosophers don't always realize that.
Right. Okay, well, Elliott, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I'd love to have you back on, because reading your work, there's so many interesting topics about probability theory and the philosophy of biology. So maybe we'll have you back on again sometime. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you, Phil. I enjoyed the conversation.